There we go. All right. Welcome. Today, we've got our Ask an Expert.net webinar hosted under Accella's innovation group, Accella Labs. And we've got two of our .NET experts here with us today. Alexander Slot, who is a Microsoft MVP, and he's also a managing consultant here at Accella. He brings an international flavor to the work that we do. He's spoken at conferences around the world, including NDC London, NDC Melbourne, ProgNet, Big Data Europe, and .NET JetBrains Global Online Day. He's also the co-founder and organizer of the virtual ML.NET Community Conference, and organizer of the .NET DC user group, and supports a vibrant developer community working on the open source project MLOps.net. So thank you, Alex, for being here today. It's a real pleasure. We also have Pat Leong. He's another one of our .NET experts at Accella, regularly speaks around the DC metro region, meetups, local regional conferences, and organizes the .NET DC users group and Tech Talk DC. And Pat, you say you focus normally on Blazor development, cloud application development, functional programming, and you've also enjoyed quite a bit reading and soccer. Although if we're going to have an international flavor here, maybe we should call that football instead. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Good to be here. Yeah.
Excellent. So the focus of our webinar today and the questions that we hope to get are primarily about migrating to .NET Core. And I'd like you all to start with giving our attendees a sense of why they should do that. What are the main benefits or the reasons that you would consider such a migration?
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, thank you all for being here and listening to this webinar today. I hope you will leave this webinar with some good insight and tips on how you can kind of address this problem. But right now, at least, the framework has been out for many years, and those who's been following along have seen that Core, especially 3.1 here, has made it possible to migrate to newer .NET. So last week as well, we have .NET 5. So now it's definitely a time to start thinking about that journey if you are interested, because there's a lot of things now that makes that possible and worthwhile. And just to mention a few from my point, and then I think Pat can add a couple more. There's all the third-party packages that you currently use for your applications are quickly moving to .NET Core and .NET 5, and will only be supporting that. So all new development in those will be kind of just locked into the new .NET Core world. And that means also that security updates as well as feature updates won't be available for you if you're still on that framework. And other things as well that are important to think about here are performance considerations. So .NET Core and .NET 5 is a lot faster than that framework. So that's going to really help you when it comes to just getting a better and faster responsive application. And the third point I would leave, and then I would let Pat add anything else, is that if you're thinking about migrating to microservices or just Kubernetes, going to the cloud and so forth, one of those enablers to get there and to create Docker images is to go on the Core to make sure they can run on Linux and other operation systems for sure.
Yeah, those are like very strong reasons. I especially agree with the any kind of adoption of a cloud native architecture or a microservice architecture. .NET Core is almost the barrier for a application to get there, and for you to utilize all of the benefits of the cloud and cloud native architecture. If you want to lower your costs, operational costs for your system. But yeah, that's just the cherry on top of the absolute necessary that, eventually .NET Framework will have an end of life. Your third-party libraries won't be updated, and you'll be susceptible to a lot of security vulnerabilities. You won't have the kind of support that you'll need, especially when it comes to communication protocols. And for example, they're definitely sunsetting like certain communication protocols that are specific to .NET that we can discuss a little later, like WCF, and eventually you will need to migrate off of it. So it's not just a you must have, but it's also a nice to have. So on both sides of the coin, it's really
and
really
I think
necessary.
other thing as well is that we are all tied to IIS, right? We've all been tied to IIS for good and bad for many years. But going to .NET Core as well enables you to go to Kestrel and other hosting abilities that you haven't had before, which can bring great benefits depending on your use case as well. So those are things to think about as well, I think.
Excellent. Thank you both for that. Alex Cook behind the scenes has gone through and taken some of our attendees and given them the ability to speak. So this may be a bit of a faster way for us to get some questions to you both about the challenges involved with these kinds of migrations and how best to approach it. So I'd encourage those of you who are attendees to go ahead and ask some questions. We've got one here actually through the Q&A process, and it is Kestrel production ready these days, or does the .NET team still recommend hosting it behind a reverse proxy, etc.?
I think we're seeing new things there every day when it comes to Kestrel's production readiness. There are a couple of things, Kestrel has been struggling with for a bit is, Windows authentication, for example, or like old school authentication schemas that you may still be stuck with if you're not going to the cloud yet. There are some mixed messaging there, I think, especially on authentication. But what I read lately is that you don't need to have a reverse proxy for those scenarios. But I do still think it's a good idea to have a reverse proxy for Kestrel if you're thinking of doing that. Pat, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to try to answer Sean's question very directly, and that no, in that if production, well, I guess if you think production ready, as in you can rely on all of the services that IIS provides, I would say like no, and that I guess Kestrel isn't supposed to be a one-for-one replacement. But like if you are concerned, especially with like Microsoft authentication, I think is a huge issue that needs to be resolved before it's considered like production ready. Especially because so many .NET applications rely on that or just Active Directory. Then like that needs to probably be like at least an answer for it besides having a reverse proxy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think there's it depends kind of where you're coming from as well. Like, are you going to start a greenfield on that core, or are you migrating over? If you're migrating over, you're going to come with a lot of baggage in general that you either need to port directly, or you have to re-architect your application to kind of function in the new world. And if you want to port things over, it's going to be a little bit difficult to Kestrel, I think, because there are things like request filtering that's not fully supported yet and so forth. And that's where reverse proxy for IIS is really helping you adopt that more easily.
Another question now. Someone asked, what are some of the things that you can do to prepare and set yourself up as best as possible for a migration prior to beginning? What can you do to make sure that it's as smooth as possible?
Sure. Pat, do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the things that you can definitely do to prepare yourself is take a good look at all of the dependencies that you have. But first and foremost, one of our recommended first steps, and the ones that we did, was that we upgraded our .NET Framework application to the latest .NET Framework version that is available at the time. At the time, it was 4.7.2. So at least 4.7.2. 4.8 is out already. So upgrading it as far as you can in order to determine, like, okay, hey, what are the compatible ones? Because 4.7.2 is probably the most like .NET Core or .NET Standard, really, that you can get. And then you can start identifying which are the dependencies that are going to not be supported. Like, for example, what did we have, Alex, that we couldn't port? Well, specifically, like some like there's certain parts that were not supported, like our dependence on I think Signal R, and that one we're still kind of struggling with.
Yeah, there's definitely things. Sorry, go ahead, Paz.
But like for example, determining which libraries, we actually just listed out all of our libraries that we had. And then we went through and determined, okay, is there a .NET Core equivalent? And then whether or not we wanted to like migrate it, or if we had to just completely wholesale, like, and then that just allows us to plan for, okay, how much work do we really need to do?
Exactly. I think the thing you can do already now is get up to date with your package dependencies. And some teams, are letting that just slide a bit, and has been done for many years. And others may keep that up to date all the time with something like the Pendabot or another implementation. But if you're not up to date with your packages, do that first, because that's going to resurface things that you will need to address. For example, going from Automapper 3.0 to 9.0 is a big move. There are more things than just like compiler issues you have to worry about. You also have to worry about behavior changes and runtime issues. So start by doing that, and you'll get a good foundation, I think.
Right. And then we didn't understand the impact that it would have to our testing framework, or like just our testing suite. And we had a lot of dependencies there. So we've actually had to push that, like our changes or our migration to .NET Core for our testing suite to like the last. And we're still kind of struggling with that because of how like even our dependencies on with AutoMock, and we had to change our auto mocking framework, and it was just like a really it's just really nice to know what parts of, do an audit of what comprises of your application, and like how much changes it needs to be done. And that's my opinion. Yeah.
One of the things that we talked about a bit before, kind of in preparation for this webinar, Alex, you were making the point that it's valuable to come to grips with some of these changes. Like, you can do that pre-work, right? Make sure the package dependencies are up to date. But then when it comes time to understanding what you're actually up against with the migration and what things might have to change, I think one of the points you were making was recommending starting with something that you can kind of segment, and then just try to migrate it and see what breaks. And then use that knowledge to help you understand what else you might have to do.
Absolutely. And I think setting up for success for this is by trying and spiking a bit and understanding what the challenges are, right? And to get to that point, the things you need to do is switch to 4.7.2 as a framework, first of all, and then you have to convert your project structure to the new SDK project structure. And once you convert it, because right now for most framework apps, you have this old heavy project structure, which can list every file that's included in your compile target and all those kind of things. And it's just very messy. It's difficult to read. But you can convert it to a new structure that's called an SDK project structure that works both for the old framework, 4.7.2, as well as for .NET Core and 5. And once you switch that to the SDK project structure, you can really be much faster on like changing your NuGet dependencies and other things, and just compile and see what breaks and how much work some things are. And as you mentioned, Trent, as well, like doing upgrades package by package is highly recommended because the compiler issues, sure, you can get those. I got 50 compiler issues. Let's address those. There may be API changes, right? There's not an issue. But the things that you don't see are like the runtime issues and like real behavior things. And if you update like 10 packages in a row, it can be very difficult to know like where a runtime issue comes from or a behavior change comes from. So I definitely recommend doing that first, running your test suite, and then proceeding to the next step.
That leads in really nicely to another question that we have from Dan. And he asks, what are some aspects of the migration that might not be obvious to everyone or immediately apparent, and uses examples of like the need to update how automated pipelines work or how artifacts are deployed, etc. Can you all speak to that?
Yeah, I can take this question actually.
Go for that.
The great part about .NET Core was that it actually it takes away our dependency on MS build. So it like greatly simplified a lot of our like build and deployment scripts that we were like previously we'd be really struggling, and it requires like a ton of parameters, and especially in terms of like a .NET framework was definitely just not designed to be on like the cloud. It's not meant to really designed to be a part of like a CI/CD like pipeline. And .NET Core had that in mind in its design. So it's like meant to be able to, extract values from like the environment variables rather than like parameters, or you are uh, all the build scripts are much more simple, and that it kind of assumes, you can have defaults that target frameworks or like which environment you're building to, that sort of thing. Really, it's that
Yeah.
was so in terms of like what might not be obvious to everyone is how it actually makes it easier for you to go to CI/CD or like simplify your existing CI/CD pipeline.
Yeah. And I think exactly as you said, Pat, like the CI/CD part is going to change, but it's not going to be more complicated. It's going to be the reversal. It's going to be much easier. Like we definitely removed a lot of build steps in our CI/CD pipelines just because it was all just down with that build and publish. The only kind of caveat I want to throw out there for like the deploy part is that um, running migrations is a little bit different. And I say this in a way that I'm going to like prefix that with saying you don't need to migrate to EF Core from EF6.4 if you don't want to, because EF6.4 is already on .NET Standard 2.1. So you can stay on Entity Framework if you wanted to, the old one, until you're fully migrated, and then kind of do that as a separate thing, which saves a lot of time and risk for you. However, if you do that, you will end up in a kind of a limbo state where your app is running .NET Core and ASP.NET Core, and Entity Framework 6.4 is trying to work with that. So that kind of throws out things like the migrate.exe tool that you are used to for running migrations in your CI/CD pipelines. And instead, it introduces something called ef6.dll. And that one is very, very poorly documented. And like literally, it's like one GitHub issue on like the EF6 repo that describes some stuff. But like Microsoft obviously don't want to support that too much. But like they made it so you can kind of be in this state for a little bit. But there are ways around it. It works just fine, but there's definitely a lot of detective work there to understand like how you run migrations in that world.
Another question here, and the attendee asks, what piece of the migration or what element of it do you expect to be the most challenging, or take the longest, or be the riskiest?
A great question. I think for us in general, I think it depends really on your application, right? If you're doing a console app like a service migration, easy peasy. I think you'll be done quickly. If you're doing something like web app that is much more inclusive, the web part is going to be the longest and the difficult part. And that's something we discovered. We kind of knew that would be tricky, but we didn't expect it to be as tricky, I think, because there are a couple changes in the way the API behaves that we didn't know about. So like the binding of your JSON payload is much more strict. It's not going to accept like,
Missing
default values,
fields.
missing values in your payload. The way you do your AJAX call needs to be very explicit. You need to set your application type and, to make sure you stringify in your JSON, etc. There's a couple of things like the framework version, like just fixed for you, assumed, and you're polished over, you're all good. So you can be a bit sloppy. But the .NET Core is very, very strict for the better, I think. But it really surfaces a lot of your technical depth on the API layer or like the web layer that you just need to kind of address, which was interesting for sure.
Yeah. And then, I agree that the longest and hardest part is definitely anything that is a part of your web API, because essentially, especially with migrating over to Kestrel, they've changed a lot of just the fundamentals of how ASP.NET applications just receive payloads. And like, so for example, the HTTP request handling that is, or just very prominent in old ASP.NET, which has to do with, accepting web requests and being able to do any kind of pre-processing that you want on it before you actually like maintain it. That has been like completely ripped out and has been replaced with the concept of middleware that is like just an entirely different, even fundamental concept to the HTTP request and response kind of lifecycle, because the middleware, it will do an action on whatever payload's coming in as well as out, and you have to kind of program for that, right?
Yeah.
And you have to be aware of like what is coming ahead of it, and like what is coming from behind it.
Absolutely. And I think just to add as well, like the web part is risky, especially if you are going to continue doing feature development at the same time as you're going to migrate the whole application. If you choose to use to pause in your application development and say, hey, team, let's go to the core, all hands on deck. We're going to do this together. Nothing else is happening. That's one thing. It's, you're stopping your feature development, but you're focusing on one thing. But if you want to continue feature development at the same time as you're doing upgrades, there's some tricks there that we've learned for sure. You can kind of enable you to do that, but that's definitely another challenge in itself.
Cool. Sean asks, you mentioned .NET Standard, but what should those new to .NET Core or .NET 5 know about .NET Core versus .NET Standard? What are some things that people ought to be thinking about?
Well, the biggest consideration for .NET Standard, and then for those who like don't really know what .NET Standard is kind of like the underlying replacement for like BCLs, or like the base class libraries for like .NET framework applications. And it's more so supposed to be just like a common API above the OS that allows you to target your application so that it can be very cross-platform. So the lower, and then the keyword is the too long didn't read for this .NET Standard is basically the lower version of .NET Standard you target, the more portable it's going to be, and it'll be consistently compliant with higher versions of .NET Standard.
Exactly. And a good example of that as well is that you're doing your package upgrades, right? You go through packages, and you, like, let's say you go and look at AutoMapper 3.0, right? And you say you can run it against both .NET Standard 1.6 and then that framework 4.7.2. If that's the case, hey, I'm on a green here, no problem. Like, this package can already run on 1.6, so it's going to be able to run on 2.1 as well. But on the other hand, like if you go into something like Entity Framework 6.4, that one's very specific. It needs to run on 2.1, for example. So just make sure, like, if your packages don't even mention .NET Standard that you currently have installed, then they definitely won't run on .NET Standard. And you need to make sure you upgrade a version of those to package, the package version that supports .NET Standard 2.0 or something like that.
Gotten a question here. It's not necessarily the next one, but I think it's one that's really important that we spend some time thinking about. And I know we talked about this a little bit before when I was getting some ideas for this webinar from you both. And it was, how do you convince stakeholders that this migration is worthwhile? How do you sort of, let's back out of some of the technical details and think more about what is this latest version of .NET going to provide to an application or an organization that's going to make their business more effective, and that would compel or justify this kind of migration that we're describing? Sure.
I think the key one here is that, back in the day, we've always had long-term support for new .NET framework versions. And when I mean long-term support, it's been long-term support. It's been like 10, 15 years for these things. That whole paradigm is shifting with .NET Core and so forth. I think the long-term support right now is 2 or 3 years only. And that's the idea from Microsoft to say, hey, you can't just stick around on something old all the time and we're going to support you, because that's not going to work. It's a bad business model. Plus, like, static applications is not a good idea. You need to make sure you can stay up to date because of security and other things. So the whole paradigm shift there is really important to kind of get on board with as well, even if you go into lower versions of the .NET Core. And second of all, it's a lot of cost savings there as well. Like, the performance increase that we're seeing is not only good for like users having faster response times, it's also going to use less of your resources. So you need less CPU and less memory. So most likely you can actually downgrade your infrastructure if you wanted to. And of course, it enables you to go to the cloud. Like without going to .NET Core, you're not going to go to the cloud. Most likely, at least, it's going to be very difficult for you. So if you have, I mean, it's very few organizations today that don't at least have some kind of strategy or goal towards the cloud. So this is definitely one of those enablers to go there, reduce cost as well by consolidating things and running them in containers.
Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say. So some operational costs, maintainability, and also performance. Like those are the three key factors. So
and I wouldn't neglect or like diminish the value of developer happiness as well. I mean, that's really important. Like if someone has like 2 job offers and one is say this is an old app on that core, the framework that you're going to maintain and build features for, or hey, this is a new and shiny app on .NET 5 and core, which one do you want to work with? And there's definitely going to be a lot easier to recruit and retain talent when you are you don't need to be on the latest, but you need to be at least on like this decade.
I definitely understand that last point. As technologists, we'd like to be working on more recent things. Are there things, though, about this latest version of .NET that make the developer experience better, beyond the fact that it is the latest technology and we'd like to keep abreast of those? Is there anything about working within it that you find superior or better or more engaging?
They are so much. Go ahead, Pat.
I mean, for the it's when they design .NET Core, it's really meant for like developer productivity and like happiness in mind. In that they are trying to build in, so making publishing your packages a lot easier, and making just like building and running tests a lot more simple, a lot more automatable. It is, and then really understanding what are the developers' needs in terms of, okay, being able to, not having to use all of your dependencies, or like trying to make a small lightweight thing that you want to deploy rather than, okay, one large enterprise application. Like for example, we were talking about some of the new feature updates for .NET 5, and one was the ability for .NET applications to now remove and like understand what are the actual depends, like in your dependencies, what is it actually using a part of like the .NET framework, and then remove unused things so that your overall footprint is like smaller. That's like something that like the .NET community has been asking for a long while, and that's just a huge thing, that just to show that, oh, hey, we're listening to what like developers are talking about, and we're actually making steps to like change the development framework.
Yeah, and I will just add one thing that I think if you're working in that framework for a while and been doing these things, one thing that you have constant pain of, and that is just really, really annoying, is assembly redirects, of having like multiple like packages depending on different sub-dependencies, and then having assembly redirects to get to newest version. And I mean, your web configs can be huge with those. We can have 100 lines with those dependency redirects. And it's a pain. It can be really difficult to get that working, and you can get runtime issues, and it's a pain. But that whole concept is solved in the core, and it's just beautiful. You can like go in your Solution Explorer and dive into one dependency, and you can expand that, and you can see what they depend on, and then so forth, and just keep everything in check and line. So I think that's one of the big selling points for myself, at least.
Good. I'm going to combine questions now from a pair of attendees. We've got one about what kind of tooling does Microsoft provide to make the upgrade from .NET Core or to .NET Core more automated. What kind of capabilities do they offer? And then given that, what aspects could have been better automated, do you think? Or what's missing from that suite of automated capabilities?
It's a great question, Trent. I think, first of all, like if you go and look at Microsoft's docs on migrating to .NET Core, it's a one-pager. It's like, here are 6 steps you should follow, and good luck, have fun. It's really like very loose, because it's it's so dependent on your application. Like you can't have one size fits all because it just depends on where you're coming from. And there are tools for automating some stuff. Like one of the most common ones I think that they support is assessing your dependencies and understanding which ones are not actually going to work, and where in your code you need to kind of upgrade some stuff. I found that a little bit harsh, to be honest. I didn't find it very useful. Like it produces an Excel file with like 1,000 errors, and it's a little bit too generic. It's not very helpful, but it's a good way of at least knowing like how close you are, because it will give you a percentage per project, and I think that's how you want to see it. So that's the only kind of way doing that. Tooling. Okay, so there's a couple of things I would say there that are lacking right now that I would see more of. There's the first thing that that you will kind of end up struggling with, or may struggle with at least, is configuration. So you have things in your web config, and you have transformations. You have the web transform for debug and maybe prod, test, stage, whatever environment you have. And let's say you have like 100 or 200 config values, and then you have to kind of figure out how they work. And you have to migrate that to like app settings JSONs or connected settings JSONs and get that working. And maybe you also have some overrides in your CI/CD pipelines. Who knows? Anyhow, that whole process is very, very complicated when it comes to making sure you don't break anything and that your transformation still works as expected. Andrew Locke has some tooling around that, and he's great in general, so definitely check him out. His tooling is, again, it depends on your application, so it can't be so general. That's the issue. But more tooling around migrating your web configs to app settings JSONs would be helpful for sure. And before I let Pat speak, the last piece of tooling that I definitely want to like to see is some automation around migrating your web apps. Because so one of the approaches we are doing or taking right now is that we want to continue feature development while we're migrating over to the core. And that's all good if you're in the lower parts of the app, because you can do multi-targeting platforms. So you can do both platforms at the same time, and you can do some preprocessor conditions to make sure some parts of the codes only run from the core. So there's ways around on the lower levels to manage that. But when you get to the web API, you're a little bit more locked into what you can do. And of course, you can create your own other project, and you can do like change a whole module over and have redirects between them and host them differently. But the way we've gone about it is migrating over slow changing code first. So things that you have your infrastructure, so part of your pipeline, for example, maybe you do like a logging handler that you want to migrate over. Maybe you want to start migrating over your global ASACs to startup.cs, like stuff like that you don't have to worry about will be changed from feature work. And the fast moving stuff though, things like your controllers and view models, all those things, we instead have built a tool to migrate that over on demand. So they will be converted on demand. Namespaces will change, dependencies will be changed, and so forth. And that tool has been very, very helpful for us to be able to like do spikes now and then to like convert, run in non-prod environments, and see what breaks, instead of having long-running branches. But that tool, I think, is very, very helpful for us. And I think parts of that could definitely be like generalized and used more broadly for many people.
Yeah, I was going to, oh yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, we got a very relevant question related to that, Alex. It says, that's a great idea for a tool. Is that going to become an open source thing that other people can use?
I don't know. That's a good question.
I mean,
okay, something to consider that.
Something to consider. I think there's like, I would say that part of this tool, at least, it's about 60% that is very broad, which is like, hey, I'm going to change this namespace because we are ripping out system web everywhere. It's going to be replaced with this. We are ripping out HTTP response message. It's going to be an iAction result, and those kind of things. Very generic stuff that you just have to do. And there are other things like the way we implement file uploads, for example, is very specific. So we want to do very specific automatic migration of those things. And that doesn't make any sense for anyone else to do, but for this specific app, it does. So yes, I think you could definitely write a tool for parts of it, and that will be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Pat, for cutting you off. I appreciate you allowing me to interject there.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was just going to kind of reiterate what Alex was saying anyhow, mostly around like the tooling part, in that I think that now Microsoft is going to much more of a community-based support. So like that's I think why they are not trying to tell you and be as like prescriptive in terms of how you upgrade and migrate your application. Yeah, and that what I would love for them to do is have like a lot more of maybe a little bit of that old Microsoft, and that they would be like at least provide for that tool that says, okay, this is a deprecated dependency, for us to be more prescriptive and be like, okay, this would be your one-to-one on, like, especially with NuGet, they have all a database of all of the third-party libraries that you can add, like maybe being able to have recommendations, or like strong recommendations, because at least now what we're having to do is, okay, we see that this is deprecated, we have a choice of like 3 separate frameworks or libraries that we can choose from. Which one do we choose? And we have to kind of like do our best guess as to what it is, what we should be switching to.
Yeah, and especially like, as you said already before, Pat, like, a lot of open source libraries that you're using, NuGet packages, they were great in that framework, but it doesn't mean that the community has taken them all the way to that core. They may have decided this was a good run, but we're not going to migrate this. We're just going to sunset it. So you end up in a situation where you have to choose to port your app to something else there.
As you were answering that question, you talked about migrating the slowly changing code first, and it sounded like you're brushing up against the idea of making sure that over the course of the migration, you can do the migration at the same time balancing a commitment to deliver new features and functions, and sort of juggling these two together. What are some strategies that you both have learned or recommend employing for doing that?
Yeah, great question.
I mean, if I may, like the biggest tool that I see us use is you can use a actual like they have a built-in statement for like use this code if it's targeting like .NET Framework 4.7, and if not, if using .NET Core, use this code. That has like really helped us like live a little bit in the middle, because now we can like target different frameworks and different versions of frameworks, and then have code that exists and that we can develop on, and know like that, okay, this code is compatible on all across the board, versus like, oh, okay, just this specific code is what we should be concerned about when we decide to make that full jump over to .NET Core.
So they're called preprocessor attributes or conditions. Yep. And to get there, what you need to do first is make sure your project files is multi-targeted. So you can change the target framework attribute to target frameworks in plural, and you can add a comma-separated list of frameworks, so .NET Core, .NET 4.7.2. And that really gets you started. I would say that using preprocessor attributes has been super helpful for us, but be very careful with it. Like use it only when you need to, because it's going to bloat your code very quickly, and it's going to be very difficult to read. But what I found really useful is that in your product files, though, you can make conditions there. So on your package dependencies, you can say, well, I haven't really upgraded this package dependency yet to .NET Core, so I'll just kind of enclose that in a condition that if we're targeting 4.7.2, included, otherwise excluded. And that's been really helpful. There's a couple of reasons why you want to use preprocessor attributes, and those we've seen so far is mostly it's been with SignalR. So SignalR, like when you have like a one-to-one match, as Pat said before, like for example, AutoMapper 3.0, it's okay. You can still stay the same package. You can just go to 9.0 and you're good to go. So that's fine. But SignalR, back in the day, the framework, it comes as a separate NuGet package. But with .NET Core, it's embedded into the ESP.NET Core framework. So there's no package to go to. So in this case, there's just no way for you to do it without, using those preprocessor attributes further down the code. If you have those like hubs or dashboard hubs further down your code base.
Cool.
So,
excellent. We had a topic a few minutes ago about justifying the migration. And there's another spin on this from a question that's come in. This person works in an organization where they have a web app that is on-prem out of necessity, they say. And so how could expectations or what kinds of communication needs to be set with clients or consumers of the application as you go through this kind of migration? How can you make sure that their expectations are being set appropriately?
I wonder how that question is framed, or is it expectations for the cloud or expectations for just migrating to the .NET Core?
It's for the client. So I don't know.
I mean,
if you want to spin it toward the cloud, maybe take that angle.
I mean, if whoever wants to ask that, I mean, you can unmute yourself and definitely ask us and explain it a little bit more if you want to.
If you want to, you don't have to.
Unfortunately, I'm not sure because the question came in anonymously. I'm not sure who exactly it might be associated with.
Yeah, it depends. You can take it from different angles. So like if we're thinking about expectations on feature development, right? We're going to migrate to the core and we're going to make sure we keep feature development happening, right? There's definitely an expectation to be set there that there is a risk involved in the migration. So we may introduce bugs that we didn't expect because of that.
Mm-hmm.
You can reduce that with full test automation, of course, as much as possible. If you want to like have expectations going to the cloud, though, like it's an enabler in many ways. It's not the solution. You without it you can't go, but with it you can go if you wanted to. But there's still work to be done in terms of containerizing your application and so forth.
Right. I mean, the way that I would answer that, especially if it's concerning on-prem, in other words, our software.
Okay.
Okay. So especially if you are going to be hosting this on-prem, like you wouldn't reap the benefits that you would have, say that if you had like you were going to the cloud, in that, lower operational costs. You can definitely have, it live and die on spot instances a lot faster than you would, because just the startup for applications is a lot faster. Just being able to build your infrastructure or infrastructure automation so that you can spin up new instances is a lot more flexible. If you're doing an on-prem cloud solution, then you could see a lot of that's where I would see the most benefits of like the .NET Core like migration.
Mm-hmm.
And
there's other things as well you get though, like you get these health checks as well that you can enable. So if you're on-prem on different servers, you can enable your own health checks, and you can make them much more deep as well for like database connectivity and those kind of stuff. Things that you couldn't really do before, I think, in the framework. So that's also an added benefit as a sales point, I guess, for your clients. And again, I think I also want to reiterate, there's lots of tooling out there and a lot of packages that you can't use in the framework, and they're only available in the .NET Core. So if you want to have it as a selling point as well for your client and really show them the latest and the most shiny stuff, that's something you need to get to the .NET Core to do.
This, I think, is a valuable segue into containerization and the cloud. The .NET Core makes it easier to use containers, correct? And if so, how does it do that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you can use containers in the .NET framework for sure. There's not like hindrance for it. It's just that your image is going to be huge, because remember, the .NET framework is only going to work on Windows. So you can't run it on Linux, which means you need to have a Windows container, which is of course a lot bigger in size than a Linux container. The framework itself needs to be installed as well, so 4.7.2. And the framework size is pretty big because it has everything from WPF to Windows Forms to app stuff, things you probably don't need anyway. So that also bloats the image a lot. Again, it's a framework app, so you need to run it in IIS. So you need to do that in your container image as well. So it gets very complicated very quickly, and it gets very large very quickly, which is not maintainable going forward. But .NET Core, on the other hand, there's things in .NET 5 that's really cool. Like, first of all, .NET Core framework, the whole like SDK for it, or if you will, runtime, is very, very small. It's much smaller than a framework. And there are cool features in .NET 5 that trim step as well to remove things you don't use in third-party packages. You can even publish your application self-contained, so you don't need to have the runtime installed. Even it can actually be shipped with the app in publish mode as well. And you can also, of course, run Kestrel on your in your containers instead, and you just have IS as a reverse proxy somewhere further away instead. So it just gets faster, smaller, and easier.
Yeah, and so in my opinion, it's just a twofold ease of use for containerization. So one is just that, like what Alex said. So your base container image is much smaller for a .NET Core application than you would have to have for a .NET Framework application running in a Windows container. And secondly, you can use any kind of operating system. So a Windows container can only run on a Windows server. And then lastly, in your actual Docker file, that is going to be greatly simplified because, as we said earlier, you don't use MS Build anymore in order to build your actual application. So now it's just a simple .NET run, right? And then so having like you not having to have IIS, you not having to have running on a Windows server. You don't have to have an incredibly complicated MS Build in your Docker file, and your your base Docker image is like, I think it's like megabytes compared to like a gig. I think like a Windows container base image is like a gigabyte at minimum, because it's basically all of the .NET Framework and IIS and like the entire Windows runtime. So
yeah.
So this gets back to the point that you all were making before about how after this migration, you could get by or consume a much smaller quantity of resources and computing power with the new images, the new containers, and so on, right? Excellent. One thing that hasn't come out in the questions that we've got, but I think that is really relevant and useful to talk about, is the kind of time frame that you might want to anticipate or plan for with a migration like this. What, in your experience, has that been like?
Yeah, so that really depends again on your application. Again, if you're doing a service-based application, a console app, we see examples of that being done in a month or less. It could be super simple. It also depends on how far back you are in dependencies, or dependency upgrades. If you're on the latest already, it's much easier. But if you're thinking about a web app, general .NET Framework web app that is like not far behind, but not super up to date, and has many projects and many inputs and outputs, I think you're looking at 6 to 9 months most likely. That's probably the time frame you want to work with to get something realistic out as well.
Yeah. And then just to give more specific numbers on our experience, is our application is around 8 years old. So it started in, I think, .NET 4.5 or 4.4, and it's made its way all the way up here. And it has, how many lines of code? Probably like
a lot.
I know.
But it has about 25 projects, 20 to 25
25 projects, and it's a monster. It's really big. And that we and we have a lot of very custom dependencies and external interfaces that are like pretty unique to our industry, our client industry. So those are also things that you need to consider. And we budgeted for like a year or so to migrate it over completely. And then this is while doing feature development and only migrating it part-time.
Yeah. And I think it depends also, like if you are hosting WCF services, if you're like actually hosting them yourself, you should add a couple months definitely to that, because you can't do that anymore. you have to start migrating that over to a REST-based service or to a gRPC or something else. Like that's not going to work. If you're consuming WCF services, that is okay still. You can still do that. That is not going to be a hindrance for you. I'm saying that with an asterisk. There are some caveats, and we've encountered that as well. There's some formats on WCF as a consumer that you can't use anymore. So most likely you'll be okay, but there are places where you'll be like, oh, probably need to rewrite that anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would definitely say that if you are hosting WCF services, the recommended conversion is gRPC, and that is also non-trivial in terms of like its conversion because very different protocols.
But very cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Dan asked another question here, and I hope I don't mangle it, but he said that we've mentioned that distributing a .NET Core app with the runtime being self-contained within the app, and then in parentheses, I think. So how does that work? And does that mean that I can ship an app to people without asking them to install something ahead of time, to make sure that they have the runtime environment or things set up? Is it possible to distribute an application with no dependencies?
Yep.
Short
answer is yes. I think you can even ship as a single file, actually. But the caveat here, of course, is that you need to know which environment you're going to run it in. Because when you publish your app as a self-contained, self-running app, you need to, you can't, there's no point, it's not going to ship with everything you need for Linux or Windows and IS. It's going to ship with anything you need for a certain specific version of Linux or Windows to make it as small as possible. So if you know you're going to do it on Linux, no problem whatsoever. You just publish it for Linux and it's going to work just fine.
That sounds pretty cool. I mean, I know when I used to develop .NET apps, there was all kinds of dependencies and runtimes that you had to push out there ahead of time. Now, this was some time ago, but
yeah,
that's
absolutely
that's
like,
excellent.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest reasons why like switching to .NET Core for me is like very, very valuable. It's just we mentioned like the maintainability, operational costs, blah blah blah. But for me, it's like the portability and being able to run .NET applications on like other environments, and so that way you can like definitely like you have even larger gains of like consolidating your IT infrastructure, so that you don't have to have licenses for Windows servers. You don't have to have like this like some of yours on running on Linux, or some of yours you just have a Kubernetes cluster and you just spin it to there, right?
Yeah, and I think performance is important as well. Like I think there's a benchmark out there that the ASP.NET Core web app was the fastest framework for web apps out there, period. And they can handle like 1 million requests per second, which is super amazing. If you think about that framework, you don't think about being super fast. And that's necessarily hasn't really been the objective neither. But they really put that foremost, I think, for .NET 5, which is super impressive to see. Even to the extent they have rewritten and their own libraries for JSON parsing and handling, because that's like text handling in general is one of the slower parts of web apps, and they've optimized that both on a memory allocation way and other ways as well.
Yeah, and Dan says that's awesome. So excellent. I agree. We've got one last question here, and we should just have time to answer it, but relatively quickly. And Sean asks if having a comprehensive test suite is necessary before upgrading. And if you don't have the best test coverage now, what kinds of tests do you really need to focus on putting in place prior to an upgrade effort?
Great question, Sean. Pat, do you want to start?
This would definitely come from Sean. This is a Sean-esque question. He loves testing. But yeah, for me, is he even on? Oh, okay. But yeah, for us, we think that like definitely the higher level for me is like the most valuable. So things that can touch the things that should behave the same way are like very valuable, especially considering that some of our unit testing projects that we had to make some like pretty significant changes to those just to make them kind of compatible with .NET Core. especially when it comes to like our mocking framework.
Yeah.
Um,
I will say that unit test is pointless. Actually, I will go as far as say that when it comes to the migration effort, they won't give you any insight. They will be annoying for you to fix, and they will be very useful for your feature development, but they won't give you any insight if something is working or not. It's kind of just like, don't even worry about them. And that's actually why we've done them very late in our migration. But your integration tests, and as Pat said, like your UI test is going to be really the ones telling you the truth of what's happening. And anything that starts with API, if that's like functional behavioral driven tests, they are super useful. And of course, if you even get to the UI as well, it's even better, because again, the API has changed the behavior of it. So you need to have tests on a UI level to make sure you catch that. But you also need tests from the API level and down to make sure things are like spinning up correctly when it comes to like hang fires, R and other dependencies. But I don't know how many times I've been saved by integration tests so far in this effort. I can't count them on my fingers or hands. So if you don't have tests for this, get tests first, because you will need them badly.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's why I made sure to mention the like things that like check behavior, because like what Alex mentioned earlier was that a lot of the things that we encountered were like runtime issues and not necessarily like compile time like issues that it changed when we converted to .NET Core. So like being able to suss that out on a like a behavioral level, that can't be done with like unit tests very well. So having a comprehensive suite of that actually ensures that behavior of the application is working correctly, that is like super valuable.
Yep.
Excellent. Good. We don't have any more open questions, and we are just about out of time. So wanted to thank you both for being part of this today, and also thank all of our attendees and the many valuable questions that they offered up. In the few moments that we have that are remaining, Alex, Pat, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to leave us with regard to .NET migrations?
Pat, you want to start?
Yeah. Do it sooner rather than later. If you have to do it, like, or if you're on the fence about it, I'd err on the side of start planning for it as soon as you can. It's only going to get more difficult as time goes on to migrate it, because of the like now is the critical juncture is basically what I'm trying to say, and that because of how new .NET Core is, there's a lot more kind of support and I'd say a lot more like documentation around the migration. And I think that as time goes on and people are already adopted to .NET Core, then it's going to be just that much more difficult because of all the features and all the like how it's going to be targeting probably like a much later .NET standard version.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, you will encounter things during your migration journey that you would never expect, and there'll be very strange behaviors, and there'll be things that you really have to do some detective work to figure out. So I think just be okay with starting off every day with saying, this is going to be a fun day. We're going to get through this together, because it's going to be challenging, but it's also very inspirational when you learn new things and see how things are working. So it's doable, it's fun, and go do it.
Great. Well, I feel like this has been a fun day. I want to thank you both again, and thank all of our attendees. We're starting to get people to drop off because I'm sure they have other meetings to go to. But thank you all for joining. This has been an Ask an Expert webinar hosted by Excella's Innovation Engine, the Excella Labs group. And you'll all get an email with a link to the webinar. We will post it on our website, and we'll be doing more of these upcoming. So thank you all for joining, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you, Trent.
How did you put it, Alex? Today's going to be a fun day?
Today's going to be a fun day.
All right. Yeah, let's do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.